Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
You can hear Alice Cooper in the background there. School's out for the summer. That's it. The folks at Queen's Park have packed up their offices, so to speak, not permanently, but have all gone back to their ridings, constituencies. The legislature has risen for the summer. So we're going to talk a little bit about what was accomplished, what we'll look forward to, and there's all kinds of speculation as what we might expect this summer. This is On the Ledge. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast with John Wright is here, along with Keith Leslie. I'm Dave Trafford. And, I think, Keith, a couple of the things we were just saying that the Premier was sort of trumpeting their accomplishments as the legislature rose to say they've passed 30 bills since February. I'm looking at his Twitter feed. 17 private members' bills. Now, you've spent a good deal of time down there. Is that a lot of private members' bills in a short period of time?
Does seem a fairly high number, although we had the caveat, or as they call it, the nut graph, that we had to put in every time I wrote one of those stories, which is private members' bills rarely become law in Ontario.
Right.
And they're non-binding. So most of them were also PC backbencher initiatives and some, declaring things, special days and whatnot. The major legislative accomplishments, I don't see them pointing to anything really. We know they had to enact some things, the emergency powers and things related to COVID, but I don't see them pointing to any single piece of legislation saying, we've passed this major education, major healthcare, what? I just don't see it. They were left scrambling and shoveling along. They sort of kept Premier Ford well out of the limelight for the last 2/3 of the session. He showed up finally on the last day. Was pretty feisty and combative out there. He got into it with the NDP, as you might expect, especially with Taras Natashak, the member for Essex in the Windsor area. He has a real knack for getting under Premier Ford's skin, and he did so again. And Ford referred to him as the temporary member from Essex, suggesting the Tories are going hard after his seat, and because he really does get under Ford's skin, which is a talent into itself. And the government House Leader, Paul Calandra, funnily enough, said he expects that by the fall, when they come back September 13th, it'll be what he called a normal session, that things will be back to normal. So that's some nice optimism there as we look forward. But in between, of course, will there be the cabinet shuffle that the Star reported is likely? Ford downplayed that, but I still think, as we've spoken about many times in this podcast, a cabinet shuffle is likely, especially over the summer. Although, as I say, the Premier's still touting the same, line. I've got the best team ever, and I don't need to change the person I came to the dance with. Although he's changing.
John, when we look at that, the Star reporting was pretty deep. There were several voices there on background talking about what was possible. The thing that struck me most interesting when you read that article was the Tory insiders were saying, if there are those who don't want to run again, or we can easily replace them because they're in ridings that we're going to win anyway. So to me, they've already red-circled a whole bunch of people to be either moved out of the cabinet or they expect are going to leave the caucus period.
Yeah, I'm one who thinks that there will be a cabinet shuffle. And I think there's a few things to note about what you just said. Number one, it's not just the people who they were touting that might get in place, and Stan Cho, people like that, who the public doesn't really know, but are important to hold on to certain ridings. They were talked about, but a couple of takeaways. Number one was it was essentially saying, if you were on the wrong side of where the COVID opening debate was at the cabinet table. Remember we used to talk about how long it was taking, 10.5 hours? It basically sent a signal, you're gone. Like it really did. There clearly were people within the structure of the cabinet that were opposing, following science and wanted to have more reopening. And it's a little bit like a hockey game. They were on the wrong team, clearly at the end of the day. So that was one takeaway for me. Number two was talk about we need to be more diversified, more women, more, reflection of our society. So that sent a signal. The third thing was, though, two other things took place that I think are aligned with that. And that was, first of all, was the announcement that Michelle DeManuel is going to be the new Secretary of the Cabinet. And that is hugely important. She comes as the former CEO of Trillium Health Network, but also she was the deputy secretary under Dalton McGuinty and also a deputy minister. The premier likes her. People who on both sides of the political spectrum know her as a mover, meaning that, I think there was some intransigence by the Ministry of Health throughout a lot of this stuff. I mean, testing in schools didn't get done because some of these people don't believe in the testing. I think she's seen as a powerhouse to move things along. So that was the one thing. And then the replacement of Dr. Williams with Dr. Kieran Moore from Kingston, that's another signal. So, I mean, you can see that there's a personnel change on the ship coming, not just in the cabinet, but in some of the other critical components a year out from an election campaign that will allow them to refresh. So I think that the Star's reporting was pretty accurate, but I also think it's aligned with other things that we're now seeing. And you have to tie that back to the campaign manager for the Premier and Nick Kouvalis, who's doing the polling, who are, again, putting all a series of pieces in place, the new way in which the Premier is not out so much, and the press conferences are done the way they are, and now the adjournment until September. I think it speaks to a pathway forward for the government that no one could see 3 months ago. So I think this does exhibit some significant change, but I find them all interconnected.
Well, the one thing I think the names, though, Keith, that came up, I mean, you're talking about Steve Clark, you're talking about Laurie Scott, some fairly prominent and significant names, Yakubuski, Jeff Urich. These are people I would have thought would have been kind of sort of the stalwart backbone of this particular cabinet. And they are the ones that appear to be on the outs. And then you combine that with Lecce saying, he would rather not be the education minister because he's worried the unions are going to target his riding. And then there's even more noise about Christine Elliott not running again. So there's a whole lot in play here.
Well, other than Minister Lecce, every one of those other ones that you mentioned predate Doug Ford in that PC caucus. So it's not surprising that they would be the ones perhaps behind the scenes that are more willing and most able to stand up to him. Whereas those that came along with him realize he really does mean what he says when he doesn't want to change dance partners midstream. He likes the people he brought along with him. So these people that came beforehand, they may be the ones most likely on the block. I don't know. They are certainly some very safe Tory seats. Do we know that they all plan to step aside? I hadn't heard that. At least they haven't publicly said so. So that's very interesting. But I think, as John says, it points to a government and a campaign team behind them lining up. It's only 11 months before the campaign officially kicks off, but as we know, it's underway now. The spending limits for third parties are in effect now. So this is them getting their ducks in a row, and it politically, I guess, makes a lot of sense.
You know what? I think there's another thing here that really needs to be taken into consideration by the government, and that is not only are you going to turn the page on personnel, but we're moving into a post-COVID world, which is incredibly different than what was before. And it actually suggests that you can rearrange government in such a way that doesn't look like the way it's been arranged previously to cope with new realities going forward. Let me give you an example. I'm doing a syndicated study on somebody came to us and said we should do something on women in the workforce. And or women in the workplace. And I said to them, well, but where is the workplace nowadays? I mean, we had 2 million people working from home before, and now we've got 7.5 million people working from home. We have a whole different dynamic here. So it's not so much the workplace as it is the workforce, because you have to take into consideration that, 2/3 of the employees that I talk to on my polling say that they're not going back. I mean, a third will to the office, but they want to stay where they are. And the vast majority of them are women. And it's not to do domestic chores. That's how they want to do. Okay, so you have to rearrange how you're going to study a cohort because things have changed. There's nothing to stop this government from looking at the world in the same way. So why do we have one minister of health? Why not 3? Why not take that intransigent black hole called the Ministry of Health, and rather than dividing it into separate ministries, which they don't talk to each other, which is a disaster, why not align it differently where there's a super minister of health and then 2 or 3 others underneath, junior ministers who actually can carve out? Why not take a focus on cities, which is a new minister of urbanology? The focus is going to be on the recovery of cities and the changes that cities are going to go through. You see, smarter people than me will figure out what the priorities are going forward. But the issue is a little bit like federally. The Trudeau government is still fighting a campaign to come based on what was before. So you can tell what they've got. They've got the environment. They've got, let's transform our society into a social network of people so that we all live together in harmony. The language debate in Quebec is even coming forward in that way. And they're fighting battles or putting a playbook forward that would have applied to 2019. But does it apply to 2022? And I think this is a real opportunity for the Ford government to actually step back for a second and say, we can put cabinet posts in. We can even reach to the outside and bring people in if we want to. We can do something really different here. Not radical, but that catches up to where people are today. And I think that's going to be critical.
Well, Keith, to that point, though, that's a playbook for the opposition to distinguish themselves as well. We can't be rear-view mirroring this. It will be a huge mistake for Del Duca and Horvath and Mike Schreiner to be looking in the rear-view mirror saying, we're in a place where we have to look at the mistakes of the past. I think the people are fed up with. That's all we've done for the last 15 months is bitch about the mistakes of the past. To John's point, the one who's actually going to have a vision for the next 10 years, I think, is the one that's going to be able to catch fire.
Well, absolutely. Everybody wants to look forward. Everyone wants to know what a post-COVID recovery world is going to look like, and what governments can do to make sure we take advantage of it, to get people out and engaged in their communities again, out spending, out going to restaurants and concerts and whatnot. But I think you might be a little quick to move on. Let's face it, I think a lot of the pandemic issues, long-term care in particular, and the government's handling the schools issue. I don't think parents are ready quite yet to move on from that. And to watch the way this government did it, first of all, they could have said it quite a while ago that we think they're closed until September. We'll do a little bit of review in the meantime. But no, they dicked around and dithered, quite frankly, and then, tried some sort of last-minute consultation, trying to get a consensus. They actually got a consensus, which was quite surprising, but everyone pretty much said, the scientific table, everybody pretty much said regional openings are the way to go. The Premier, again, it wasn't the Education Minister out in front of this, it was the Premier who said, no, I'm going to close the schools. I'm afraid of more cases coming in. And the way they treated this, just like it was politics as usual, there was the leaks to the media ahead of time. The Premier's leaning against opening schools. And this is in June. We're at the start of June, for goodness sakes.
Well, and the idea that they went out in the field and did polling. Seriously.
They're polling in there because at such a late date, it's just ridiculous. And then, of course, it turns out that the Premier heads over to, he got a letter from an 11-year-old boy named Arthur, gets in the truck, hops over to Arthur's house and gets consulting with Arthur, who's really upset about not going back to school. And they negotiate that Arthur would be happy if every graduation, not just grades 8 and 12, but every grade could have a graduation ceremony outdoors. So the Premier said, well, yeah, that's a great compromise. Arthur's negotiated this. So that's what he told the schools they can do. And of course, massive surprise to the schools, the school boards, and everyone else who says, you can't pull it. You can't, even just organizing in a normal time to pull off that kind of thing in 3 weeks is pushing a lot of them. Anyway, it just seemed all ridiculous. The Premier stepped in, put 2 rakes in front of himself again and banged them both into the face. Why? There was no need to tell the Arthur story. There was no need to hang all this. You're already going against the advice of everyone, the consensus you sought. And his response to, when he was asked, well, you've got the consensus that you asked for. And his response was, well, they only answered one question. So basically they got an incomplete on their homework, and I'm not going to rely on that consultation. It was all petty politics. And again, it comes down to the Premier going against the science on the schools. I don't think that issue, or I don't think the horror shows in long-term care will be forgotten in the next campaign. no matter how much we look forward, how many changes we make in the cabinet, how many changes we make in the chief medical officer of health and other communicators, those issues are still going to dog the Ford government next June.
I don't disagree that it will be there front and center in a campaign, because that's what the opposition will do. I am troubled by the fact that as a citizen, as opposed to a pundit or someone doing polling, that I get conflicting messages from even the medical community. I mean, yes, they would have said, well, let's open here and do, let's get the kids back to school. But I also saw Staney Brown that said that we could have, the variant rip through the schools at between 7 to 10%, producing 7 to 10% more cases. We haven't got kids vaccinated. We've got teachers that are not vaccinated as well, and we only had 6 weeks to go in the school. So I think there's another issue here that we're not yet tackling, but is going to have to be tackled later on, and that is there will come a breaking point here where the absolute rule of the healthcare professionals, in fact, is broken. People will it's been hard enough. Like the issue why we don't have testing in the schools is not because of the Ford political machinery. It's not because he doesn't want it. It's because the Ministry of Health and others believe that it's not worth doing. How do you bridge that gap? Like I was thinking this week, Keith, I don't know what it would be like at some point for a premier or somebody to actually differ and attack. It's not my... I would make a lousy politician. I'd be standing there and say, hey, look, it's not my fault that we're not having testing going on. It's theirs. They can't do it. It's an intransigent block. We're going to do everything we can to get them to move that. But I've wanted testing in front of schools from day one. And it's, and then they go, well, you're the premier, you should be able to do something. On the other hand, you kind of go, yeah, but we know what bureaucracies are like, and you got to stick dynamite into it and blow it up. I mean, George Smitherman, I don't know if it's true or not, but basically was told that he kicked doors off their hinges because he would go into a meeting and say, I want this done. And they'd all go, yes, we can get that done, minister. And then only learn 2 months later that nothing had been done on it. So I think there will be a point coming where the public and others sort of say, Dr. Williams, you said if we get this under 1,000 cases a day, then we're good to go. Well, we had 699 the other day, and we're still not good to go. Like, what says we're good to go and when we are? Then we have the Minister of Health saying we might be able to open a little bit earlier. Well, wait. So I think all of this ties into how the medical community and others, at odds with each other oftentimes, are giving contradictory advice and not following through and other things, and we have the political guys held hostage to whatever happens. But again, I think there's going to be a break with that coming soon, because the new world is going to unfold, and we can't have it run like the old world. The question is, how do you make the transition?
I don't disagree at all with what you said, because it was one thing you said reminded me a lot of my first sit-down interview with Dalton McGuinty. He'd been in office about 7-8 days. It was his first sit-down interview, and I said, what's the biggest surprise you've uncovered so far? And he said that when you pull the levers of power, some of them don't do anything.
That's the quote for the week on the ledge right there.
And I never forgot that. It seemed even a surprise to him. And he'd been opposition leader for a number of years beforehand. He knew what he was walking into. And the reality is, as you say, the civil service controls the situation on the ground, and they know their political masters change every 4 to 8 years, so sometimes their intransigence will stop something from happening that a government really wants to happen. The whole testing thing, I just don't understand in other provinces. In Nova Scotia, they've been rapid testing since the beginning, finding all kinds of extra cases. Not that many, but enough to justify the rapid testing. And it's done by volunteers at pop-up clinics all over the place. So the volunteers get in to get tested. It gets everyone just in the habit of getting out, getting tested if there's any outbreaks in your community, and brings the numbers right down again in a hurry. So that whole thing with the testing in schools, perhaps that is not Premier Ford's fault. It is the fault of the bureaucrats in the health ministry, but someone should be held to blame for that, because it really, really would have given everyone just a level of confidence, if nothing else.
Yeah, you guys are being way too easy. There's no chance in God's green earth that we are going to look at this and say that Premier Ford is not the last guy who's accountable for this. I don't give a good goddamn what the bureaucracy is all about. That in fact, Ford has to be the guy who's going to wear this, period. Now, my point about, putting it in the rearview mirror, I don't think the electorate is going to forget this, Keith. My point was that the opposition has an opportunity just to ride that wave and provide a visionary for the future, for the next 5-10 years, that is not negative. We're going to take care of that all by ourselves in terms of how we approach this campaign.
But they've got
but
two
there's
jobs,
no way. Well, okay, but there's no way Ford, you can let him off the hook on this. There's
no, he's not getting off the hook.
No
but look at the jobs of the opposition guys. Horvath, it's her fourth campaign. She's got to convince people she's got something different, that they didn't reject the previous 3 elections, whereas Stephen Del Duca is who? And he's got to spend the campaign introducing himself to Ontarians, because even up until then, they're really not going to know. And he's going to have a policy or 2 at best that can attract attention. Versus he can't ignore all this negative stuff. Yes, it's going to be looking back, but they're going to have to do that as well. Their ads are going to have to focus on that. But as you say, they have to find some forward-looking plan or program that can boil down into a very easy, quick slogan, because we know Doug Ford is really good at the sloganeering.
Well, their own version of common sense.
Well, something
right?
like that. But they're trying now. They're looking at things. What are they going to promise us? $10 a day daycare? Really?
I think
30, you need something more than 30-year-old promises, is what I'm thinking. And the NDP and Andrea Horwath, they need something that they haven't presented in the previous 3 elections. What is it?
I was watching Steve Pakin's show the other night with great delight, and they had Janet Ecker on, and they were talking about Brampton Billy in 1975. And they were going through that, a photograph of Bill Davis with smoking a cigar and a pinstripe blue suit made the rounds and basically boxed their brand in by saying, he's out of touch, he's just a big fat tycoon. And then they went through the transition of turning him into Brampton Billy, who was your nice uncle. And still is today, and saw that they got their jabs. He and Kathleen got their second jabs yesterday. So congratulations, Premier and Kathleen. Nice to see you there. But, it took certain people there. Hugh Siegel was one. Ed Stewart was the other one. We were reminiscing about things from the past, but the smartness of that era was as follows. Going into the 1981 election campaign, they had not only to deal with the Constitution and Astrotrust Raymore, and I remember that because I was an intern there, but they had created something just prior to that, and it was the Board of Industrial Leadership and Development. And the Board of Industrial Leadership and Development, you remember that, Keith, it was to pump money into infrastructure and to move the economy ahead. But what's Bill Davis's name? Bill Davis. What's BUILD stand for? Build. I mean, it was smart. It was, the tactical way of doing this. So all around to say, the premier of this province will not be let off the hook for anything. And nor am I or anybody, suggesting that he's going to be let off the hook. There are certain things he's done right, certain things he has done wrong. But he only has to have 37% of the public agree with him. His approval ratings currently are at 35%. 37% have to agree with his vision of the future, and he's back in power. He's like Mike Harris with another majority. So I don't see that it's about necessarily everybody holding him to account and they winning. The issue to me is that if you're going to have a campaign a year from now, then the next month is the time to be preparing for that campaign. It's not how we've treated the pandemic, where it seems like we're 3 weeks behind where we should be. Now is the time to do it, because you've got decisions. I would make the cabinet shuffle in middle of July and give them a chance to wait until they get into September so that they're there. But I'd also advance a bit of an agenda and a new way of approaching it so that I could catch up to where the people are. I just close with this. There is a mood out there that's really, really surly. And I've said this before, and I can see it here. On the one hand, in the United States where things have opened up, they've had the best months for people ordering stuff, buying things, going out and doing things. That awaits us here. But there's also a comeuppance that's within the population that if somebody looks the wrong way over the next 8 months, and it's going to snap them in the ass. And that's something that I don't think you can avoid, and that may be the time when the reckoning takes place next June at the polls, and no one's going to get off the hook then. Nobody.
Well, the only thing, and I'd just be curious to get your take on this for sort of the last step in all of this, because it's important for us to be talking about the campaign and forward thinking and how are we going to govern in this COVID lingering era. but I still don't think we fully appreciate the depth of the damage that's been done to our business sectors, our retail, our restaurants, that, once we finally get out and start to walk down Main Street, Keith, we're really going to understand the depth of the damage. And some of it's not recoverable.
Well,
and therein lies the real, I think, that echo pandemic that the government's going to have to deal with.
How many dreams were just shattered by COVID? I mean, how many small entrepreneurs starting businesses or have maybe in their first or second year, those years when you don't expect to make money, it's the third year where, maybe we'll break even. And they're just either completely shut down or trying to get by in some sort of takeout, delivery, curbside pickup, which just doesn't work for a large number of businesses. As we know, the Main Street businesses in many communities are just dried right up. There's no walk-by traffic. There's nothing to draw people in. You can't go in. I don't know. I know there's been a lot of business supports. Governments have tried their best, but just we've seen these businesses go under, whether it was a gym or a small restaurant, or how many of these places are still going to be there? That's a real question. I mean, have they been able to hang on now? And even if they have, what kind of debt are they holding on to now? What are their monthly payments all of a sudden now versus what they were before? And do they have to rely, if they're a restaurant or food business, do they have to rely on 30% of it still going to Uber from now on forward, or whatever? So I don't know. I think our worlds are different. I think our worlds are going to be very different. But it's going to be, John says, there's still that pent up desire to get out and to spend. So those that have managed to hang on, they will get some initial bump of a recovery right away. I think people just anxious to get out, but how many have managed to hang on?
But Dave's raised a really critical point here, because the statistics for unemployment came out today. And across the country, it's 8.2%. We lost 68,000 jobs last month in this country. And if you look at certain age cohorts, the unemployment rate is running at 11.2%. So to your point, I mean, you can, for those outside of Toronto who are listening to this podcast, if you kind of go midtown to St. Clair and Yonge Street right now, there's a whole section of that street where there are no, like southbound on the left-hand side, there's no stores there. That there is gone. If you go to certain parts of the city, whether it be on Queen Street or King Street, the most populous areas, they're all gone. And the question goes back to yours, Dave. What's going to emerge? I mean, we may have, 1 million people unemployed anyways. How do they surge back into the economy? How can you say, well, we'll just go and open a restaurant? Well, you got to go and borrow the money. You got to put all that sort of stuff into it. Man, I'd rather buy a house than buy a restaurant. That's for sure nowadays. But I think then it goes back to the Ford government and also to the federal government. What do? Do you put money into subways? Or do you put money into people's pockets for, new entrepreneur opportunities? These are real choices, but it goes back to what I said before. The Ford government's going to have to deal with the new reality. I mean, they may have to make some decisions about their fiscal structure. That's not the sort of thing a conservative would do, but the things that the people need and they have to do. And that's where this restructuring is going to have to take place. But my God, 11.2% unemployment between those who are 15 and 59. Oh, my goodness.
Well, we said it before, that in all of this, Doug Ford's biggest challenge probably is his redefinition of what is a populist politician now, because that's changed based on what you just said, John.
We can't leave this podcast on a downer, Dave.
I got one for you. Why did Ford then, as a populist politician, I think to bolster that, he let 550 frontline healthcare workers into that Game 6, the Leafs Canadiens series, and as someone said, I wish I had thought of it, it was in case all the Leafs choked at once. And there we go. That's an upper note for that. Sorry for Leaf fans, but
that's a positive.
But I said at the time, I'll say it again. I've got a household full of Maple Leaf fans, and I was certainly hoping for them. But I'm so glad they collapsed at that stage, because it just signaled to Toronto that we're getting back to normal. So
exactly,
things are returning to the way they were in certain avenues. I wish they were better, but thank God we can move on now.
Well, we'll leave it at that. Go Islanders. That's just that's where I am.
Colorado.
All right. Oh no, I'm having a good deal of fun watching the Islanders. That Bruins series, awesome. Anyway, Marchand's goal last night, just
Yeah.
crazy
Yeah.
shot. Anyway, we've just gone off and become TSN. That'll do it for this week. We will be back next week because there'll be other stuff to talk about. Even though the legislature's taking a break for the summer, we'll be here off and on through the coming months. So if you like what you hear, share it. Certainly subscribe to it. And we always want your feedback on what you hear on the show. So feel free to leave us a comment wherever you hear your podcast. It's On the Ledge, the Ontario Politics Podcast with Keith Leslie, John Wright. I'm Dave Trafford. This is an Eye Contact Podcast.